Okay, so Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. Now, have a look at this picture. Firstly, I want you to think about the atrocity of 9/11. What was it? Why did it happen? And why did the people who committed this atrocity do what they did? And these answers will help you set the context for today's poem. So if you consider these questions and pause. Okay, so 9/11, as you very well probably know, was a terrorist attack in the heart of New York, USA on September the 11th, 2001. Two domestic planes were hijacked by religious extremists who were working for an Islamist terror group known as Al-Qaeda and were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, killing thousands of people in the process. The hijackers were attempting to strike fear and hatred into the US and believed by taking their own lives in this way, they were serving a religious purpose. They were brainwashed and manipulated into thinking that what they were doing was courageous and heroic, but in reality, it was cowardly and evil. During these events, thousands of people lost their lives. However, today we're focusing on how people can be driven to perform extreme acts and what drives them to carry out these acts, but also how they have choices in their own lives too. So let's have a look at the learning outcomes for today's class. So to describe the events of the poem Kamikaze, to explain the dichotomy between life and death in the poem, and dichotomy is a division or contrast between two things that are represented as being opposed or entirely different, to evaluate the choices the pilot made and how the writer used voice to emphasize these. So just a little bit of context about the poem, which is always really, really important when we're looking at this anthology. So during World War II, the Japanese army became desperate towards the end of the fighting, as it was clear that they were losing. And in this desperation, the Emperor of Japan ordered the Japanese pilots to fly directly into enemy warships in suicide missions. And at the time, if anyone refused to complete the mission, then they were deemed cowards and shunned or outcast from society. Now, today, for some in Japan, the kamikaze are treated with respect and honor, but for others, many others, it's become a mark of great shame. So Kamikaze is about Japanese suicide bombers. Now, I want you to consider these questions when you watch the video, and also read the poem and watch the video. The video is Beatrice Garland herself reading the poem. Okay, so I want you to watch the video and read the poem.
Yes, Kamikaze. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag, waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. And the neighbors too, They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die.
Okay. So I've included the poem here, but obviously you have it in your anthology. Let's look back at the questions. So consider these questions now and pause. So in this narrative poem, it's highly narrative, Garland explores the testimony of the daughter of a kamikaze pilot. And unlike many of his comrades, the pilot turns back from his target and he returns home. He looks at the sea beneath him, remembers pleasant memories from his childhood, and decides to return back to his base rather than die for his country. The consequences for him are then sketched out in the poem for us. And not only is he shunned by his neighbours, but his wife refuses to speak to him or look him in the eye even, and his children too gradually learn that he is not to be spoken to, and they begin to isolate and reject him too. And how does his daughter feel about this now? Well, I think that your questions in the poem kind of indicate that. We will explore that a little bit further. Okay, now we're going to look at form and structure, which is always vitally important to look at. So consider these questions regarding the form and structure of the poem. So how many stanzas? How many sentences? What is the significance of this structure? Okay, so if you could pause here now. So, as I said before, this is a narrative poem. It starts in terms of the form like a kind of summary or a report. And notice here that sections of the poem are actually in italics here. Okay, so and though he came back, we've got these italics here. And they're in first person narrative, where the storyteller speaks directly for herself. And this has the effect of heightening the sense of sadness that she feels, which may help to answer the previous question there. It's written in 7 6-line stanzas, and there's no rhyme or rhythmic pattern. So this style, along with the regular stanza structure, allows the story to be told very simply, letting the tragedy and the emotion shine through, but allowing the readers still to make up their own minds about events in the poem. It's only got 3 sentences in the entire poem. So hopefully you will have noticed that. There are only 3 full stops. And this could reflect the idea of a story being told orally. And the first sentence runs over the first 5 stanzas. So I don't know if you did notice that. We had the first 5 stanzas there. As we're told about what the pilot can see from the cockpit. We're given an awful lot of sensory information here, an awful lot of detail. I'm just going to take that obstruction off here. Oh, it's not letting me. Okay. So we're given a lot of this sensory detail, and we're allowed to imagine much more exactly the circumstances of the pilot's difficult decision. Again, with sensory information, it gives a picture to the reader, it immerses the reader. And the second sentence marks a shift in time and speaker. And here we hear the daughter, and this is the bit that I underlined in italics. Until this point, her story was retold in the third person narrative, creating a distancing effect. But now the reader is suddenly brought close to someone with a direct interest in the story that she tells, speaking at a much later time. And this new sentence also informs us that the Kamikaze pilot turned back. Now, finding out this information at this point packs real impact by the placement of it within the poem at this point, where the poem has a shift in time and speaker. And the final sentence is only 3 lines, and it reverts back to the third person, but it adds another twist, emphasizing the fact that the pilot may have thought he would have been better off if he had died in the suicide mission. And each change in speaker and each shift in time has a jarring and quite unsettling effect on the reader, and perhaps it expresses the turbulent but repressed feelings of the daughter. So the next part, we're going to look at analysis stanza by stanza.